Today we begin our trip into the land of Genesis. And we're going to begin this by taking a few sessions of background context information. Some of it very broad, some of it particular to the Bible, some of it particular to Genesis, some of it particular to that time and place. But it's going to be, for the most part, very broad to give us a good grounding and background. The analogy for traveling into Genesis and reading it would be similar to us making a trip overseas where we're going to go visit a foreign country. And we're going to spend a month there, touring it and living there. And let's say we really don't know much about that country. We've never been there before. We don't know much about its customs and traditions, or its language, or its government, or its history. Its belief systems, where we can only guess. If we want to make the most of our trip, if we want to get the best possible return, our investment of time and money and effort, we should study that country before we leave. We should get an idea of the language, maybe learn a few words, of its belief systems, its true history that it's gone through to make it into what it is today, its form of government. We need to do some background research and information. Another example, another analogy, would be like my experience when I was a senior in college. By my senior year, and certainly by my second semester senior year, I had taken all my major requirements and all my minor requirements. And I was at that point just finding courses that would fit into the schedule I wanted and take courses I thought might be interesting. So I signed up for 2 engineering courses, and they would be back-to-back on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So it'd be 3 hours each day. I'd not had any prerequisite engineering courses. I'd had my math, but no engineering courses. So I walked in there the first day of class, and I sat there for 90 minutes, and I had no clue what was going on. I understood very little. It's like I was in a foreign land with a foreign language and foreign customs and foreign traditions. So I sat through the next course right after that. I had the same experience. So as soon as that course was over, I went to the administrative building and I withdrew from those engineering courses, and I took some other courses that I was better suited for. I just did not have the background, and I would have wasted my money. Such is traveling to Genesis. When we travel back to Genesis, we're traveling to a different time, a different place, a different nation. In fact, going to Genesis is far more distant and far more different than us traveling to any other place in the world today. And so the next few sessions are going to be prepare us for this trip, so that the trip into and through Genesis bears as much fruit as possible. Now, when we think about Genesis, we need to look at the whole for a moment and recognize that it's basically constituted by multiple chapters, 50 chapters. And the chapters are divided into 2 great parts. The first 11 constitute what some people refer to as primeval history. That's from the creation story through Adam and Eve, down through Noah and the flood, Tower of Babel. And then we move into chapters 12 through 50, which deal with basically a family tree, through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So the first 11 chapters are primeval history. Primeval comes from a Latin word, and it's basically a conjunction of 2 words, primavus and avum. Primavus means first, or prime, or early, and avum stands for age. So it's the first age. When we talk about that primeval history, we talk about history itself. I like to think that history is told 2 ways, through 2 means. That is, ancient history. It's told through the artifacts we find, the items we find, the tools, the implements, the cooking utensils, the foundations of buildings, even the bones and skeletons and skulls of people. And we can pick these up, we can dust them off, we can look at them with a magnifying glass. Some we can put under a microscope. We can carbon date some of these. And they tell us about history. But they cannot tell us the whole story of history because something is missing. Something that came into being about 55, 54, 5,300 years ago. A few months ago, I read a story about the remains discovered of what was believed to be the oldest set of remains for a Homo sapien, that is a human, in Europe. I think it was in modern day Germany. So it was uncovered, it was examined, analyzed, it was dated. So they believe that this was the oldest set of fossilized remains of a human being that far north. The earliest of the pioneers, the migrators from the southern area into the northern latitudes. It was a female. And through various testing, they assumed that the age was somewhere around 45,000 years old, maybe older. Now, if we assume that this woman lived 45,000 years ago, and her body, the skeletal remains, constitute an artifact of history, we have to remember that she lived and died 40,000 years before we had the advent of writing. True writing, narrative writing. I'm not talking about proto-writing. Proto-writing is a combination of signs and symbols. It's not true script writing. So script writing was developed by the Sumerian Empire in the area of Mesopotamia, in the area of the Fertile Crescent, also referred to as one of the cradles of life, and it was east of where the Israelites live today, likely in parts of modern Iraq, maybe even southern Turkey, and down into the Persian Gulf area. So it's this ancient civilization that brought us writing. And they brought us writing 150 years or so before the Egyptian Empire brought us their version of writing. Once we had writing, we had a much better record of the history of mankind, because now he could capture his thoughts, his ideas, his plans, even accounts of business. And it lended much more credence and shed much more light on the history of man. So when we go back into Genesis, in the first part of Genesis in this primeval history, we're exploring a land, a time, in which there's much still to wonder about and much which to search for. And one of the problems and one of the shortcomings of Christians going into the Bible to study Genesis is that many Christians have a hesitancy to broaden their aperture, to look at anything other than these early Hebrew people as portrayed in the scriptures. They don't want to glance to the left or the right and maybe be exposed to ancient civilizations. I suppose that reluctance comes from a fear of being cautious about touching anything that would be pagan. Anything that would be poly, that is polytheistic, many gods, because we're warned and admonished to stay away from those things. But it was in that environment in which Genesis was constructed and the people lived. So we have to open the aperture, because we'll learn more about the Bible when we learn more about the adjacent civilizations and cultures at that time. So let's go back in time. And if we were to visualize that part of the world, today we call it the Middle East. It tended to be called that, plus called the Near East at one time, years ago. So if we look back there and we draw a bullseye around the area where the Israelites live today and call that the center of the map, then if we look at that and we go up and down that coast, the Mediterranean Sea, there's a name for that land area. It's called the Levant. And it's known as a land bridge. It stretches from southern modern-day Turkey, which at one time was called Asia Minor or Anatolia. So it's a land bridge down that coast, which also would go through Lebanon and even southern parts of Jordan and Syria and Israel and down into Saudi Arabia, land bridge. And the land bridge had a purpose. That's a mechanism people use to pass from the north to the south. And if you're in the northern area, you were in Eurasia. And Eurasia is the conjunction of two continents, Europe and Asia. Modern Turkey sits astride two different continents. And the continents come together on the Bosphorus Strait, which empties into the Black Sea. And is straddled by the city of Istanbul, which is the largest city in Turkey. 2/3 of it's on the western side and 1/3 on the eastern side of the Bosphorus Straits there. As a matter of fact, if Turkey is considered a city of Asia, it's like the 10th largest in all of Asia. If Turkey is considered a city in Europe, it's considered to be the largest city in all of Europe, bigger than Paris, Rome, Moscow, and London. So from this southern part of Turkey, you have the Levant, a land bridge. It allowed for transportation down into the northern African continent, and the northern African continent contained the Egyptian Empire, so there was a lot of trade there. The Levant now also indicates a point and place of conflict between religions, where some religions want to lay a claim to the entirety of the Levant, while other religions still live there, and that is their ancestral home. So that creates friction and tension between peoples and nations. But we can use that middle of the map to indicate where Israel is. Now, if we go east, we go into the desert and dry areas, and we head into what was called Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia is an overarching name, and it gave rise to many civilizations over thousands of years. It's also called part of the Fertile Crescent, which begins down around the Persian Gulf, arcs northward and then westward and then southward, and looking like a crescent. It's also, that Mesopotamia area is one of the ancient cradles of civilization, along with the Egyptian Empire and the Indus Valley Empire, which is further north in Pakistan. But the Sumerians in that area there predated the other civilized nations. Now, man was coming into what was called the Neolithic area, or the New Stone Age. The development of man, the history of man, is often reflected in various ages: the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. As man's talent and techniques and scientific expertise expanded, then he was able to work with different materials to make tools or weapons, implements for everyday life. So man came out of Neolithic to Stone Age. And as he came out of that time, man started to transition from a particular type of people into a different type of people. The transition was to move from hunter-gatherers who foraged for their food, who were on the move frequently because they ran from their enemies and they ran after food, whether the food was animal food or people were migrating and moving where vegetables and fruits were available and they could scavenge and pick those off vines and trees and out of grasses. So man would pursue food of different sort, and he would flee from his enemy. And therefore, he ended up being in families and clans. But he was nomadic. He went where the food was available. He went where it was safe. The two great motivating factors for early human. And then coming out of that Neolithic period, man started to develop agriculture. In other words, in-place farming. And with the advent of in-place farming, you had villages and settlements and even cities and towns and empires arise. Not sure if it was the in-place farming that predated and made necessary the cities, or the cities made the farming necessary. Because if you were farming in one place, communities would go around it, up around it, and be close to it. And if you were living in one place, you needed a good, solid source of supply, which agriculture would get you. So it may be the case of the chicken and egg. What came first? The farming in place or the settlements? Then you had the earliest empire probably was the Sumer or Sumerian Empire. They're the ones that first developed writing. They're the ones who allegedly invented a wheel, mathematics, agriculture. All these things today that are just a normal part of life for us. So they were a very advanced civilization. Now, after they had their day in the sun, you're moving toward around 2350 BC, about 4,400 years ago. And you had the Akkadian Empire become the dominant force in the eastern area there. And the Akkadian Empire had, I guess, its first king, who had a splendid name for a king. His name was Sargon. Sargon. Sometime after Sargon's time, you move into the early 4000s. And we're introduced to a figure that plays a titanic role in Genesis. He plays a titanic role in the faith of the three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His name is Abraham. We first know him as Abram before God changes his name. So here's another one of the reasons that we have to open the aperture and look at the other cultures and civilizations and belief systems, not just those that were instituted and used by the Hebrews, the Israelites. Where did Abraham come from? He allegedly came from a city called Ur in the area of the Chaldeans, and it was on the Persian Gulf at one time. The waters of the Persian Gulf receded and they lowered, and now it's 10 miles away from the Persian Gulf. But at one time, the sea level was higher. And so this Abraham was, by virtue of where he lived, his cultural and his social connections, he was polytheistic, I should say. So he believed in multiple gods. He worshiped pagan gods. And you could describe him by modern terms as a heathen, a pagan. The patron god of his city, which at one time was an enormous city in those days, upwards of 65,000 people in Ur. The patron god, the patron divinity, was the moon god. So God calls a pagan worshiping polytheistic man to become the patriarch of these great religions. That shows that God has always endeavored to redeem us and transform us. And that's what Jesus does and has since his ministry. Jesus came to redeem us and to transform us into the kind of people that he wants us to be. So the story of this conversion of Abraham is, in a way, the story of the conversion of all believers for all time. It's a signal of what God wants to do. If he could do it through Abraham, he can do it through us. And so this Abraham came out of this civilization on the eastern side of where the Israelites would live one day. Polytheistic, pagan, idol-worshiping man. God made him into a great man of faith in God, who established a personal relationship with God and he with him. But not only did Abraham come from that area, he wandered and meandered through what would end up being the Holy Land many years later. In addition to that, he actually ended up in Egypt, which was at the other extreme end of the great civilizations there. Also a polytheistic, pagan-worshiping culture, society, and civilization. So Abraham touched all three areas where people lived and formed or would form civilizations. That's another reason we need to study them all. Now, when we look back at ancient man, who has now discovered writing, we have various accounts that are preserved. And one of these accounts is preserved in the Bible. It's the creation story. But that's not the only creation story we have that remains today. because these other civilizations, with their own religion and belief systems, also undertook to describe their world as they understood it and how it came to be. In other words, their world and how it was created. Now today, on some of these accounts, we use this term called mythological tale. And we denigrate, because when we say something's mythological, we're saying it's a fable, it's a fairy tale. It's been concocted. It's not an accurate recording of what actually happened. Many people want to claim that the creation story in Genesis is also a mythology, a mythological tale. It's made up, it's not true. And therefore paint Christianity and Judaism, beginning with the same broad brush as the other primitive religions. That does a disservice to not just the account in the Bible, but the other accounts that man authored. When ancient man sat down with a stylus and a stone tablet or clay or whatever he used, and he sat down to ponder how his world worked, how it operated, and how it came to be that way, he was telling the truth as he understood it. He was not intending to lie. He was not drawing up a fairy tale. He was writing his understanding of the world, how it worked, how it came to be. It was a good faith, honest attempt by people who lived 5,000 years ago. Now, one thing that all these civilizations, including these ancient Hebrews, had with the other civilizations is that when they undertook to explain how the world worked, they knew that they could not do that adequately. And therefore, all of these areas would resort to the divine to explain things like who created the sun, where did the moon come from, where did storms come from. So they would reach into the divine, the supernatural, for their answers. They weren't lying. They weren't telling a fib. They were doing their best they could to understand. And they knew that what man did not create but existed was created by someone more powerful than man, meaning the supernatural, meaning divine. So we do them a disservice when we call them a mythology. They were early man's best attempt to explain how things worked. In my study and my reviews to prepare for Genesis, I had 13 different sets of commentaries, multiple volume sets of commentaries. And as I read through these, I found that just the introduction section to Genesis for some of these books was 100 pages long. And as I stumbled through these, I started to run across a recurrent idea or theme. It was in addition to the idea and theme that Genesis provides an account, a recordation of the understanding of the creation of everything. In addition to being an ancient written account, the story in Genesis of creation also served another incredibly important role. It served as a polemic against what ends up being pagan mythologies from ancient civilizations. Now, polemic is basically what constitutes an argument against another system or set of beliefs or form of government. If you were going to write a story or an article about your form of government, as you're writing that and you talk about the benefits of your form of government, almost implicitly, you're writing against, it's a polemic, you're writing against other forms of government. And so not only does this story in Genesis tell us the account of how things came to be in a way we could understand and carry it on, but it also strikes at the heart of other false theologies and false teachings. When I finally started to realize that, and trace those ideas into Genesis, it opened my eyes. And so I want to share some of those with you. Because this polemic is not something that's expressly stated in Genesis, but it's there. It's there if you read it with your eyes wide open. So let's look back and we look at these other civilizations, and they had creation stories, and they attributed creation to divine. But they used multiple gods, many gods. They were poly, that is, many God, polytheistic, many gods. So they had a lot of creator gods that played different roles. Not so with what we have in Genesis, that is the one true God. And in that one true God in Genesis, we Christians see the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but that's still just one God. And so our story of the one true God, the one creator God, stands in contrast to ideas that you had a lot of different gods all playing various roles. Also, with those other accounts from ancient civilization, those gods tended to be arguing and fighting with each other. They just didn't get along. They're duplicitous, and there were all kinds of intrigue. Not so with our one true God. And even when you look at our one true God as the Holy Trinity, triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they're not arguing and fighting and tussling with each other. They're on the same page, working to the same end. So that's another argument against those other belief systems that prove to be inaccurate. In those other accounts of creation, it seemed that those gods were working with something that was already created, some sort of matter or substance, and in effect, they were forming things. They weren't true creating. They were forming or reforming or shaping. Forming and reforming and shaping is far different from creating from nothing. Our God in Genesis is the God who created everything from nothing. It's called creatio ex nihilo. There was nothing, and he created everything. It takes a far more powerful force, a far more powerful God to create from nothing than to rearrange. In the other accounts, it seemed that the creation of man was an afterthought, and that man was sometimes created in these other accounts to serve God, to provide food for gods. So man was unimportant in the grand scheme of things. That's a very dangerous notion, and that notion exists today in our modern culture. And it tends to result in a culture of death, not life. In our creation story in Genesis, man is not an afterthought. When you drill down into the steps and stages of creation, you see that God is creating and building toward making a suitable place for man. Man is not an afterthought in our God's creation story. Man is the crown jewel of God's creation story. Human life is valuable. These other types of world or religious systems say man's an afterthought, he's not valuable, he's not important. If we believe that man is no more important than any other aspect of nature, we cheapen life. And it makes it easier to get rid of life that's not convenient or not productive. Not so with our theology as in Genesis. God actually made the food for man. Man's important in God's scheme. Not to the point where he should be arrogant or dominant, but he's important and he's valued. So we can see by elements of these other religious beliefs from ancient man that Genesis stands in sharp contrast. But the old thoughts about man being worthless and dangerous, those are not just ancient beliefs. They're carried through to modern times. And they rear their heads in all kinds of ways in which man practices inhumanity against man. So this is just the beginning of our move into Genesis to provide some background information. And we'll continue this with the next session. In the name of God, amen.